This lecture concludes that on Victorian England, but now turns to the modernist movements in the Pre-Raphaelites and also the aesthetic movement. Now, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was going to be made up of three artists, namely Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who was the leader, as well as two other students from the Royal Academy, John Everett Millais and William Holman Hunt. The theoretical and critical underpinnings of the Pre-Raphaelites' ideas can be attributed to John Ruskin and his publication of Modern Painters, a series from 1843 to 60, and this critic, poet, and artist who was going to scorn the Academy and the public for preferring the tricks of the brush, for their being blind to an art of noble conception and perfect truth. So the sentimental art that we talked about last time in Victorian Britain is seen to be overlooking what made art great. So his book instead was designed to teach the public to become more discerning viewers, so they would of course produce good art. We should also note that John Ruskin famously had his marriage annulled because he had no knowledge of female anatomy other than ancient classical statues. And when he realized that women had pubic hair, he was so disgusted he could not consummate his relationship, and once again divorced. So we find that Ruskin is going to scorn the appreciation that many people had for such sentimental genre scenes as Richard Redgrave's The Poor Teacher. So this is lacking in substance, as he would call it. So the Pre-Raphaelites took the directness and seriousness instead from the early Renaissance, that being the artists that came before Raphael. As they would understand it, Raphael would introduce the classicism of the High Renaissance, completely abandoning the medieval purity that came before it. Therefore, they looked at the works of Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Perugino. Now, the serious literary themes, they believe, needed to be addressed instead of these genre scenes directly. Only rarely could they do that, for they looked at the Bible, Shakespeare, and Arthurian legends. Now, the only time in which genre scenes were seen to be all right to reproduce would be if they were moralizing and didactic, not merely sentimental. So therefore, what they would do is combine symbolic realism with these serious themes, along with symbolic content and very realistic, detailed imagery. And these three items, these notions in combination, are why the Pre-Raphaelites are so beloved. Here, with John Everett Millais, we have a good example of the combination of all three with Christ in the Carpenter's Shop of 1849 to 50. Here we find the religious subjects are going to be common early in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's years, and they would often showcase spirituality above materialism. In this example, we find the young Christ in the workshop of his stepfather here, Joseph, and once again he is bending over to kiss his mother. But everything in the image is going to foretell the crucifixion and the significance of Christianity. Off in the background, we have the sheep representing Christ's flock that are looking over this makeshift fence. We find that he has injured himself on his hand, holding it up, that being foretelling and prefiguring the crucifixion, as the nail would pierce his hand. We find that the implement held by Joseph is going to foretell this. We find there's a dove directly above him relating to the Holy Spirit, and there's a carpenter's triangle right above Christ's head, referencing the Holy Trinity, of which he is part of the Godhead. And then off to the right, we have the young St. John the Baptist bringing a bowl of water. So he was responsible for instituting the sacrament of baptism. So a very symbolically laden work, but also very detailed. Now here we find that the additional elements could be encountered in any shop, so the meticulous details are going to be recorded by the Pre-Raphaelites, including dirty fingernails, much like Caravaggio, and the wood shavings. These two things need not be in the painting, but they include them for veracity, for, once again, historical accuracy. Now, critics would call this blasphemous, for Christ is not idealized. As a matter of fact, Charles Dickens is going to state that Christ was a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy in a nightgown, and the Virgin Mary was quite ugly, he said. So therefore, this is very different than the earlier representations of a beautiful version of each. So here is a detail of the aged Mary, and the red-headed, we should note, is the real issue here with Christ, is that we do not have positive associations, heroic ones certainly not, in the history of art with anyone red-headed. So here, even the most naturalistic artists in the early modern era, such as George Delatour, in the same scene with Christ and, once again, St. Joseph doing carpentry work, they would still idealize Christ to make him beautiful, to match his spiritual significance. The Pre-Raphaelites did not, and thus were criticized for it. A similarly unidealized approach can be seen in Rossetti's Ecce Ancilla Domini of 1849, in which we can clearly see art is used as a vehicle for representing ideas instead of narrative scenes. In it, we're going to have the episode in Luke whereby Gabriel comes and tells the Virgin Mary she will give birth to the Son of God, stating, "Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God." And so we find that in this image, she is cowering away from the angel, as all of these symbolic elements are going to be included. So if we compare it to an early Renaissance version, we can see the recoiling of the Virgin Mary is not unusual. How she is presented, though, in a very realistic fashion with life drawing is. So here we have studies made by Rossetti of a young girl recoiling and crawling off into a corner. So this is the first element, but this is combined, this realistic approach, is combined with many blatant symbolic references, as well as almost flattening out in an abstract sense the whole image. So here, the white lily representing purity expands through the whole color scheme. So the flower held by Gabriel, given to the Virgin Mary, is going to be the same color as Gabriel's gown, as the Virgin Mary's gown, as the bed on which she rests, and even blends into the color of the walls behind them. The colors that are included are, of course, going to stand out even more because of this monochromatic color scheme, whereby blue is behind the Virgin Mary. And remember that blue represents the Virgin. She will always wear blue. Whereas red in front of the image to the lower right is going to represent the blood of Christ and the future sacrifice of her Son. So here we know that Rossetti admired Flandrin, and in his trip to Paris in 1849 made studies and copies after examples of Flandrin, whereby he would simplify areas of flat color and space, as in Christ's entry into Jerusalem that we discussed, to where we have now a flat, abstract understanding of the image combined with very naturalistic details. So critics are obviously going to point out that there is excessive didacticism here as far as hammering home and hitting the viewer over the head with the obvious symbolism. And there is also minimal formal details. So the large white areas are also going to be criticized because it flattens out or washes out the image. The example here by William Holman Hunt is also another example, yet this one is very richly detailed and quite complex with his Light of the World of 1851 to 53. Here we have a bearded Christ dressed as a priest in a green chasuble, with a crown of thorns on his head and a halo around it. The pamphlet is going to describe how to interpret the work, and it also is going to state that the weeds down below represent idle affection. The neglected orchard behind him represents the uncared for riches of God's garden, whereas the lantern he holds is going to represent the conservator of truth. And finally, the rust even on the door represents the corrosion of the living faculties. So all of these elements are very, very laden symbolically, as the last example with Rossetti and the Virgin Mary. So this becomes a very popular image by way of religious circles. But this overt symbolism is also what appeals to the populace. This is not from the Bible. There is no episode in which Christ comes knocking on a door holding a light. Instead, it is the symbolic idea of what Christ represents as the light of the world, hence the title of the work, and comes from John and the book of Revelations, whereby Christ is going to state that he is the light of the world, and behold, I stand at the door and knock. So these two taken together are the biblical origins and the passages that are responsible for the work. Now, it is admired for its detailed, and in this case, its idealization, unlike what we looked at with Millet. However, we find that Millet is going to learn that realism would not bring success. And so both artists, as demonstrated here, are going to start combining and tempering their realism with idealism. This is the juste milieu, or middle-of-the-road approach, that they seek to gain critical acclaim and the appreciation by the public. Their ideas are forward-thinking, and they try to match what Ruskin wishes good art or high art to be. What they wind up doing is a type of systematic eclecticism, where they're bringing together elements from the Renaissance with the realism of the day. Another famous example of the Pre-Raphaelites comes by way of John Everett Millet's The Death of Ophelia in 1851. In this, we have Shakespeare's Hamlet and the suicide of the rejected lover. She is driven to madness after Hamlet murders her father. In this mermaid-like water, she is going to be bore up, as it's discussed here. So we can see her after she has died with flowers around her, surrounded by this greenery. Now, the detail that we have and the idealism and beauty on Ophelia's face made the work popular, for it is not overtly grotesque or overtly inappropriate like Christ in the workshop with dirty fingernails and or redheads. We could certainly understand their approach there, but instead is going to capitalize on the beauty that is seen often in mermaid paintings, so appreciated in England. So what we have here are the details of the setting combined with the fashionable beauty of Ophelia made this work a success for the Pre-Raphaelites, as Hunt's work was also going to be successful because it combined idealism with details. So you have to have both for public appeal. It also is going to have a precedent, and the art historical precedent is the sexy suicide. We see this especially with Lucrezia and with Cleopatra. This notion that women are dying but still look beautiful and desirable even after their death. However, as mentioned early in their careers, all three painters in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood focused on religious subjects. They began moving away later in their careers and producing a modern foil for it. So here we have seemingly a genre scene, but one that's going to tell a moral story. It is very moralizing and didactic. For what we are looking at is a prostitute who is sitting on the lap, very inappropriately, women would not do that, and entertaining a wealthy man. She sees a light, which we can see a mirror behind her, and what she's looking at out the window. The light and beauty of nature is what she is drawn to, and she realizes the evil of her situation. Hence the title of Hunt's work, The Awakening Conscience. So here, the material world is the argument of the Pre-Raphaelites anyway, will distract from spiritual matters. So there is a biblical verse even inscribed on the frame. But instead, critics still focused on the scandalous nature of the subject. It is still tied to a religious message, but it shows a prostitute, and that is difficult for critics to get past. You even see the cat hissing in the lower left-hand corner, often relating to lasciviousness and of women caught up in these types of activities or being seduced the night before. The same, of course, could be said of the Olympia, which, of course, was universally scorned, even though it presented a straightforward nude model in such a way that fell within the tradition, but upended the different ways in which you would show or be allowed to show nudity. So the Pre-Raphaelites had little interest in improving society as a whole. Instead, they're using art as an escape from the brutal realities of contemporary life. So the sentimental genre scenes were still quite popular among the middle class, such as The Teacher that we discussed here by Redgrave. Here we find Frith and At the Seaside with Ramsgate Sands. This one was bought by Queen Victoria, showcasing and showing us the leisurely activities of the bourgeoisie. This had enormous success at the time. This is a genre painting in the same way as Redgrave's is, but now we're going to be moving towards descriptive accounts of the middle class in a documentary manner instead of a sentimental manner as in The Poor Teacher. So here we have an exact contemporary, that being the Stonebreakers and Courbet as Frith, but they are not political as we see here in England. They're meant to entertain the viewer with their miniaturist style, not the rough brushwork and monochromatic style of the realists. Instead, we are meant to look at all the individuals and how carefully their costumes have been attended to and what they are all doing, even in a comedic fashion here at the seaside. Now, in the same way, we have the narrative genre taken up also by photographers, and Henry Peach Robinson is an excellent example of that in Fading Away of 1858. In the image, we have a very similar scene, and it seems as sentimental as The Poor Teacher. It is staged as such, too, and it looks like a young woman or a daughter of the family is dying, where the father is leaning against a window, contemplating the loss of his daughter, while the mother looks on to the left and her sister attends to her to the right. So the same type of sentimentality and, obviously, its photography and appreciation for details can be found here. So this is going to be quite common, and people knew this quite well, both from their own lives, but also from novels. And that is deathbed scenes of children and adolescents. And this reflected the reality of what people went through, as many adolescents and children died from tuberculosis, cholera, and diphtheria. So here we know that Henry Peach Robinson hired models to pose and shot each section, such as the mother, the father, the ailing young woman, and her sister separately, so that they were all in focus, because it would be impossible to get them all in focus at once in this setting. So he would then combine them with multiple negatives to create a combination print, where everything has dramatic light and sharp focus. Everything is in focus and made possible with a combination print. So exhibitions, as would show these photographs, would mount it on cardboard. They would have them matted and framed. And additional text would help enhance the meaning of what's happening here as this young woman fades away in this deathbed scene. Now, it was, of course, criticized because the girl was not actually ill, and this is very important for understanding photography early on. This idea that the camera never lies, and the idea that the camera is a scientific instrument that can only show what is in front of it. But early on, right after the invention of photography, special effects and ways in which to trick the camera and the eye are already being invented. So this notion of anything seen in a photograph being absolute truth and representing veracity is called into question. That's what people had a problem with here. So photography then also adopts the vocabulary and subjects of painting. So they start using the same terms and refer to this as art photography, much as we discussed with Daguerre, with the invention of photography in general, is that we have photography setting up and using the same subjects and genres in order to make it comprehensible to the general public. So here we have a much larger example with Oscar Gustav Reglander's The Two Ways of Life of 1858. In this, we have a massive combination print, and we know that Reglander is known for his anecdotal scenes, but is most famous for the stage genre scenes under large allegorical themes. Here we have one that's bought by Queen Victoria, though of course it was criticized for its nudity and is very un-Victorian in that way. It is made up of 30 negatives in all with this combination print. In it, we have the left side where an old sage is trying to point a young man in the right direction. There are two different paths in life. One leads to disillusion, the interior of a bar with gamblers, prostitutes, drinkers, and idlers. On the other side, as one might imagine, you have the virtuous life, filled with work, religion, family, and charity. A nude woman covers her face, as you might imagine. So this is the path that one should choose in this overtly moralizing allegory. This is not new. In the North, we have these types of moralizing allegories going back to the Middle Ages and certainly fully developed by the Renaissance, as seen here in Peter Ertzen's Meat Still Life, whereas on the right-hand side in the background you have a tavern with prostitutes, and on the left-hand side you have the Madonna and Child giving alms to the poor, going to church. So there are two different sides to life and two different paths one can take. So in this moralizing allegory, we're trying to show or elevate photography beyond merely a mechanical device and or a sideshow kind of attraction. Now, there certainly was a discussion as what was art's purpose at this time, and photography is in the middle of that discussion. But this leads us to Algernon Charles Swinburne, who was a poet and a critic and a friend of Rossetti. He admired Baudelaire and Gautier, and he was an advocate of l'art pour l'art, or art for art's sake, arguing that art need not be moralizing or it need not instruct. It need only entertain the viewer. Therefore, the purpose of art was art itself. This is an appeal to the senses, this aesthetic approach, or a sense of perception. Therefore, by the late 1860s, this theory that art need only be art became known as the aesthetic movement. Here, Walter Pater is an English art historian, and in his school of Giorgione is going to argue and associate art with music, stating that art is superior to nature and that formal elements are more important than content. What it looks like is more important, in other words. Therefore, these critics very often would defend their position by looking to music, which is going to be the perfect art form according to them, devoid of content and instead representing pure form. So here we have Rossetti's Mona Vana of 1866. And in this particular example, we have an iconic presentation of a beautiful woman not doing anything. It is not narrative. It is also not a portrait. What is interesting is it's not even an actual woman. It is an idealized vision of a woman, the vehicle for what beauty would be in a picture, which is not entirely new. We had this in the Renaissance as well. We see here the portrait of a woman by Palma Vecchio. Arguably, the Mona Lisa even is perhaps a portrait of just a beautiful woman. But in the Venetian tradition, we certainly have this idea that people would collect paintings, not because they knew these women, but instead because they were beautiful, and you wanted something beautiful around. Hence la bella here, the beautiful. So Burke, if you remember, with the notion of the sublime, is going to state that experience of beauty should be compared with sexual arousal, or what he called an inward sense of melting and languor. Now this was, of course, appropriate in this male-dominated society, in that the notion of beauty would be equated to the male gaze and objectifying a beautiful woman. So here we have Edward Coley Burne-Jones in The Golden Stairs, where a student of Rossetti is going to literally show us art and music brought together. Now, women here are seen as the principal theme, and they all hold instruments. This is not a story, importantly, from history or the Bible. Instead, we are reducing the color scheme to shades of yellow and blue with a semicircular composition with these irregular contours. Now, it is a musical theme in that we're considering the colors in terms of tones and harmonies, like we would shape in the same form of music. So in this way, we have a pretense for understanding an art form that doesn't need to tell a story from the Bible. It doesn't need to be sentimental. It merely needs to have an effect on us. This leads us to James Abbott McNeill Whistler, more commonly known as Whistler, an American artist that grew up in New England, but then befriended Courbet in France after studying there, and moved to England and befriended Rossetti. His notion of art for art's sake also is going to align in this aesthetic movement with the belief that it need not show anything or represent what it might look like in reality. He would abandon subject matter entirely and embrace the formal elements of art, thus arguing that painting is like music, and would title his work Symphony, Sonata, and Nocturne in order to emphasize this point. We find that Whistler is most famous, possibly, for his painting of his mother, otherwise known as Whistler's Mother. However, the proper title for the work is actually The Arrangement in Gray and Black from 1871. In the work, we find that the fact that his mother is present is incidental. Instead, what we have is a compositional arrangement, as the title suggests, with these overlapping planes and forms of black and white. Now, the same can be true when he finally abandons subject matter almost entirely later in his career. Similarly, here we have the Symphony in White No. 3, the first work where Whistler used a musical title, which could theoretically be considered a genre scene with two women in contemporary dress. Now, the two girls are dressed in white and leaning on a white couch. Therefore, the contrast between the straight lines of the room and the arabesque contours of the girls are what visually make it interesting, since everything else is roughly the same tonality. So we find that this approach parallels the criticisms we saw earlier for Rossetti's Ecce Ancilla Domini painting, in which we have the Virgin Mary and Gabriel also entirely dressed in white. Only this is going to build on that idea. Here, just 4 years later, we find Whistler, as an aesthete, is going to devote his attention to landscape, the only aesthete to do so, or the artist that's going to be practicing art for art's sake. Here in the Nocturne in Black and Gold, or The Falling Rocket, the title suggests two things. One, a musical accompaniment and or composition, and the other is the more naturalistic representation for what this references. Now, the term nocturne would remind people of piano compositions of a meditative character, particularly of Chopin and other classical composers, that would take place at night, hence this painting is a nocturnal scene. Additionally, we find that what is shown, the title suggests, of The Falling Rocket, is certainly fireworks, but we do not see in the Cremorne Gardens in London, where this is actually taking place, a very realistic landscape. Here we have a painting of what it would look like objectively in the upper left. Instead, we're going to evoke the magical mood of the glowing sparks that are falling back to Earth after their ascent to the heavens. And we have, of course, a limited color scheme with blues and blacks that are going to be in the background, illuminated intermittently by these bright bursts of color. Now, this is going to find its precedent in Turner, the British artist who nearly completely frees the brushwork, as we discussed, from its mimetic or descriptive responsibilities, instead communicating the power of the brushwork and of abstraction, to still communicate a believable landscape setting and scene. So we have these daubs of paint added instead of carefully blended, and this is the precedent for this type of near complete abstraction. Now we find that not everyone appreciated the aesthetic approach practiced here by Whistler and seen earlier by Turner. We find that the most powerful art critic of the day, John Ruskin, is going to criticize Whistler publicly for his lack of detail and for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, criticizing him for charging the same amount for this painting as a more traditional, realistic academic painting. Whistler in turn sued for libel, and we have following this the Whistler-Ruskin trial, which becomes the test case for the theory of art for art's sake. That being, can art merely be? Does it need to be incredibly well crafted and finished? Does it need to clearly teach us a moral lesson or how to live our lives? Whistler asserts, on the other hand, that art was nothing but an artistic arrangement. Therefore, that's all it needed to be and do, and he said he succeeded in accomplishing this task. Now, we find this becomes the central tenet of modernism in that art does not have to have a moral imperative, nor does it have to look realistic, which leads us in a new direction in the art world in the 20th century. Now we find that Whistler wins the case. The crowd is very receptive, and so are the lawyers and the judge to his argument. He's very witty, but he goes bankrupt in the process because in the 19th century in England, those that do the suing have to pay all of the bills for both parties involved. So he won, but lost all of his money regardless. Next class, we will continue on with the second midterm. So remember to watch the review session on the midterm and review the study guide. And as always, reach out with any questions you may have.